Here we go. Let's go. We are now going to learn about very important matzah ashira. Okay, you sometimes go to the store and you're going to buy some matzah which says matzah ashir, which is matzah made from fruit juices, right? Are you allowed to eat that type of matzah? We're on 35A2, the Mishnah, the Lamed Hamad Aleph, the Mishnah. So we're going to talk about the different ingredients that can be used for matzah. So here we go. Eilu dvarim. These are the species of grains she'adam yotz ben yudach chavasa b'Pesach that a person can fulfill their obligation on Pesach. So which types of grains? Bechitim, wheat. That's the standard one. B'sa'orim, with barley. B'kusman, with spelt. Uveshipon, with rye. Uveshibolas, shol, and oats. All those are valid ingredients for matzah. Doesn't say you should charge more for them, but okay. The bottom line is that those are all the different ingredients that could be used for matzah. V'yotzin, b'dmai. You could fulfill your obligation with dmai. Now that is a bit novel. Dmai is a produce which you buy typically from a not so observant individual. And the question is, did the person take tithes? Did the person take ma'asos from it or not? Normally, right, you're not supposed to eat it, but the question is if you, because you have to be careful about it, but the question is, if let's say you did and you ate matzah made with those ingredients, the halach is you fulfill your obligation. Uve ma'aser rishon shnitla trumaso, or ma'aser rishon whose truma was separated. Okay, what is that? What that is as follows. We have an obligation to go ahead and give truma. Truma is given to the Kohen. And then ma'aser rishon is given to the Levi. Ma'aser rishon is, truma is undefined amount, but ma'aser rishon is 10%. After we give a little bit to the Kohen, we give 10% of our produce to the Levi, and then the Levi has to give from his produce to the Kohen. So the ma'aser rishon is what we give to the Levi, and he gives truma from the ma'aser rishon. So once he takes off the truma, the remaining food, which was ma'aser rishon initially, is actually permitted for anyone to eat. And the Mishnah is telling us you could make matzah with that produce, which presumably is not really novel because anytime everyone's allowed to eat that. In other words, again, what we're talking about is you give to a Levi 10% of your produce after you gave truma, and then he gives truma. That produce is always permitted to all of us. And the Mishnah, for some reason, has to tell us, oh, by the way, you fulfill your mitzvah of matzah, which, again, doesn't seem to be a novelty. The Gemara is going to discuss this, God willing, tomorrow. Of ma'aser sheni v'hektish aniftu. Ma'aser sheni and hektish, these are, ma'aser sheni is a produce that you go ahead and you're going to eat in Yerushalayim, and hektish is something you consecrate for the Beis Hamikdash. Let's say a person does that, and then they have, let's say, food, wheat, that they are that's either ma'aser sheni, or they designate wheat for the Beis Hamikdash. So then they say, you know what, I want to go ahead and take the value of that ma'aser sheni. This actually would be very common. People who have ma'aser sheni as food you have to go ahead and separate and eat in Yerushalayim. But the problem was it was a lot of food oftentimes. So what they would do, it's hard to travel a lot of food. So they would do is they say, okay, here's the money, here's the food, and now I'm going to take the value. Let's say it's $100 worth of food, $1,000 worth of food. Great. I'm going to take the value of that food and put it onto these coins, and then they travel with those coins, right? Because it's easier to travel with a purse than it is to travel with a whole ton of food. So that is food, ma'aser sheni, which was redeemed, which that food is always, again, permitted for anything. So again, it's hard to understand what the novelty of the Mishnah is, but it's telling us that if you had food which you designated for ma'aser sheni, or it's food you designated to give to the Beis Hamikdash, then you said, I'm actually want to use this food. I don't want to travel with this food. I'm therefore going to take the value of it and transfer it to this money. Now this money is hektish. Now this money is used for ma'aser sheni. The remaining food is redeemed food. The Mishnah is telling us I can use that to make matzah. Again, hard to understand what the novelty is because you're allowed to use it to make pizza on a regular day. Like this, it's not kodesh anymore. So what the chiddush is, the Gemara is going to talk about again, God willing, tomorrow. Kohanim are allowed to fulfill their obligation with challah, with matzah made from challah. Right? You have to keep in mind that we live in in an unideal world. In other words, nowadays when we separate challah, we burn it. But in an ideal world, back in the day, the challah would actually be given to the Kohen. So let's say you give the Kohen the challah portion, and then the Kohen goes ahead and makes matzah with it. That would work. Uvit truma. The Kohen also is the one who receives truma. He's allowed to make matzah with the truma. Avalo b'tevel. Tevel is something which is untithed food. In other words, it's produce that was harvested and prepared and piled up, and then you did not yet give any of the tithes from it. That is called tevel. You cannot make matzah from tevel. Avalo b'ma'aser rishon shalom nitla truma, nor with ma'aser rishon when the truma was not separated. Right. In other words, I give the Kohen, the Levi, his ma'aser rishon, the 10% that belongs to Levi, and he does not separate the truma out of it, which means it's forbidden for anyone to eat. That you can't make matzah with. Okay, nor if you have ma'aser sheni or something designated for the Beis Hamikdash, you cannot make matzah with any of those things. You do not fulfill your obligation. Okay, chalos hatoda. Let's say a person brings a Toda offering. Bless you. So Toda offerings, you would normally bring a ton of bread with your Toda offering. This was done, the Chazal suggests, deliberately because they wanted to ensure that you would end up sharing your challah, the bread that you make. In other words, when you bring a Toda offering, it's for something good that happens to you. Okay, so you normally bring the animal, and then you also have like a ton of bread. Why is there a ton of bread? Because you have to finish it within a certain amount of time. How do you finish so much bread in a certain amount of time? Lots of guests. Hey guys, we're making a party. This is the origin of a Sudas Haudah. The notion is you want to let people know. So let's say you have a lot of challah, a lot of bread left from a Toda offering, so Rikike Nazir, or if it's the unleavened, if we're talking the unleavened ones, obviously ones which are not chametz, or let's say a person is a Nazir, at the end of the Nazirus, at the end of the Nazirus process, you have to bring certain breads are eaten. Okay, again, let's assume that they are not chametz, they're unleavened. A person made it for himself for the sake of a Toda offering, or for the sake of bringing it as a Nazir, then Ein Yotzban, you cannot fulfill your obligation. A son limkar b'shuk, let's say a person made them to be sold in the marketplace, right? Keep in mind, you go to Yerushalayim, and in the market, you'd have people just selling food for like, oh, anyone buy, or they say, look, these are special Nazir things, like they're fit, they're the right size, the right measurements. So a person makes them to sell in the marketplace. Then they say, you know what? I don't want to sell it to the Nazir. I want to use it for matzah. Then Yotze Behen, you're allowed to fulfill your obligation. So if you made it for yourself to use it, you can't do it. If I made it to sell it for someone else to use it, then I'm allowed to use it again. Of course, the Gemara is going to have to explain what's the difference. We'll get there. Tana. It's Tana and Brisa. Kusmin min chitin. Spelt is a species of wheat. Shipol shual v'shipon means sa'orin. Oats and rye are a species of barley. Okay. Now the Gemara describes the names for these grains. Kusmin gulva. Kusmin is also known as gulba. Shipon dishra. Shupon rye is known as dishra. Shibol shul shivile tala. And Shibol Shul oats are known as Shavile Tala. Okay, and basically, in case you're reading this Mishnah and you don't know what these translations are, we're reading the Art Scroll. They don't have an Art Scroll. They don't know what these words mean, so they just explain it to us so everyone knows we're all on the same page. Okay, 35a3. Honey in. Okay, from the Mishnah we see that the flour of these 5 grains are included as valid matzah. Orez v'dochen lo. But to make matzah from rice or millet is a type of grass. I think in Africa they would make like bread and bread products from it. That cannot be used for matzah. Minani mili. Why not? You know, where do you get this from? In other words, you can make rice bread, right? So why can't you use it for matzah? What's the issue? So Amr Shem Melakish v'chein Tanad ve'Rei Shmuel v'chein Tanad ve'Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov lo sochal alav chametz. The pasuk says you shall not eat chametz with the Pesach offering, and then the rest of the pasuk says shivas yamim tochal alav matzos. For 7 days you should eat matzos with it. So it juxtaposes chametz and matzah, right? And the same pasuk it talks about eating matzah, it also talks about not eating chametz. So what's the significance of the juxtaposition between not eating chametz and eating matzah? Dvarim habaim lidei chimutz, things that come to leaven when left to rise. Adam yotz b'em lidei chavas matzah. Those are things which could become chametz, are things that you could use for matzah. Yatsu elushem habaim lidei chimutz el dei stirchon, as opposed to things like rice flour and millet flour, which do not come to leaven, but on the contrary, literally they spoil. But the point is the rising process is different. So basically what this means is as follows. Leavening, the process of leavening is that the gas bubbles get trapped, and that's why it rises. Okay, so there's gas bubbles, they get trapped, and that's how they rise. Rice doesn't have that capacity. So when rice rise, you can make rice bread, but it's a different process. It's not called leavening. Okay, so what we're learning from these psukim over here is that something which could become chametz, i.e. leaven, okay, like something which has those gas bubbles when in the leavening process, that's something that could be used for matzah. Okay, so that includes wheat, barley, rye, etc., etc. Something which does not become leavened, like rice. Rice does not have those gas bubbles. It doesn't do that. Therefore, it can't be used as matzah, right? They go hands in hand. Something which becomes chametz could be used as matzah, and rice cannot become chametz. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara, Masnisten to Rabbi Yochanan Manuri. Our Mishnah, which says that rice and millet are not going to be good matzah, means that our Mishnah is not going like Rabbi Yochanan Manuri. Why? The Orez means daganhu, because Rabbi Yochanan Manuri actually holds that rice is a species of grain. V'chayavin al chimutze kares, and he holds that actually, if you go ahead and make bread with rice, it's actually going to be a form of leaven, and therefore, if you go ahead and do so, you're actually going and you eat this bread, rice bread on Pesach, you'd actually be chayav kares. This is not the source of the Ashkenazi custom not to have rice bread, because we don't paskin like him. But he was actually much more stringent. He held that rice is actually chametz. We don't hold it's chametz. We just hold that, that it's kidios. We can mix it up with bread because it's similar. But he holds, Rav Yochanan Ruko actually holds that since it rises, even though it's not leaven, it doesn't rise scientifically, it rises in a different way, but he holds it's actually full-fledged chametz. Okay, the Tanya, and now Brisa says this explicitly. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri oster ba'orez v'dochen. He forbids someone to eat a dish cooked with rice or millet during Pesach, mipnei shekarav lahachmitz, because such grains are close to leavening. So now the Gemara is going to try to understand, what does he mean by saying it's close to leavening? Ibailahu shekarav lahachmitz doesn't mean that it's close to, when he says it's close to leavening, dekadim machmitz, that it leavens quickly. In other words, when he says it's close to leavening, does he mean that it actually rises faster than regular grains? Odilma karv lahachmitz have chametz gamor lo have. Does he mean that it's close to leavening, but it's like close but no cigar? It's similar, but it's not identical, right? So again, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said it's close to leavening. Does he mean that it's close, meaning the time frame for it to leaven? Whereas let's say with regular grains, it takes like 18 minutes. That's why we have the 18 minutes thing. But rice is 10 minutes. Let's say it's close to leavening, or does he mean it's close, like it's similar to leavening? Which one does he mean? Tashma, Tanya. So we're going to bring a proof from a Bryce. Tanya, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Orez min daganhu. Here he says explicitly, rice is a species of grain. V'chayavin al chimutze kares. You're liable for consuming its leavened form. But right, so he said that's the key line. Basically says that if you have chametz that it's full-fledged chametz. If he says the punishment is kares, then he's not saying it's similar, and that's the problem. He's saying it's mamish. It really is chametz, and that's where we're gleaning from this brisa that rice is full-fledged chametz. And a person fulfills their obligation for Pesach by eating rice matzah. Also, kramis. Okay, we're going to define what kramis is in a moment. It's also subject to taking challah, meaning he holds it is an actual flour. Okay, my kramis. What is kramis? Rabaya shitza nisa, my shitza nisa. What is shitza nisa? Papa shitza nisa demishtaka bene kala nisa. Shitza nisa is found growing among poppy. They define it as fennel flour. Okay, the bottom line is that we see Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri explicitly telling us that he holds rice is full-fledged chametz, to the point that if you eat rice bread on Pesach, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, you would get kares. Again, we don't pass it like that. If you eat rice on Pesach, you're not going to get kares, but as Ashkenazim, we don't do it because it's too similar to bread. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri held it is mamish bread, and our Mishnah, which only listed 5 grains and did not list rice, obviously is not going like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Okay, good? So far so good? Yeah. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Reish Lakish. Isa shenilosha biyayin v'shemen udvash, dough that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, ein chayavin al chimutza kares. One is not liable to kares for consuming its leavened form. Okay, so let's say you make dough, as many people make dough with like different like fruit juices, right? Either it's a wine, or you put oil in, you put honey, then you are not liable for kares if you eat it, if you eat matzah, if you eat if you eat bread made out with these juices or with any of these liquids, the leaven that comes out of it, the bread that comes out of it, you can't eat it, but you will not be chayiv kares. Okay, not be chayiv kares. Okay, now the Gemara is going to try to understand why with great ramifications. Yasiv Rav Papa Rav Huna Braid Rav Yeshua Kamed Rav Idi Bar Avin. Okay, so Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, were sitting in front of Rav Idi Bar Avin. Okay, Rav Idi Bar Avin was the Rebbe. The Yasiv Rav Idi Bar Avin become an amnim. The Rebbe, Rav Idi Bar Avi, was sitting and dozing. Okay, oftentimes the Gemara has stories the opposite. The students are dozing. Over here, they're learning in front of the Rebbe, and the Rebbe himself starts falling asleep. Okay, it happens. Amar le Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua le Papa. So the two students start talking to one another. Okay, what are they going to wake him up? So they start talking to each other, and they say, "My time to Reish Lakish. Why did Reish Lakish say that you are not liable to kares for consuming leaven that's bread mixed with wine, oil, or honey? Why did he say that you are not going to be chayav kares?" Amar le Rav Papa responds to his colleague Rav Huna, the son of Yeshua Damar Kra. He says, based on the pasuk, lo sochal alav chametz. The pasuk says you shouldn't eat chametz. And then again, the juxtaposition we saw before. Don't eat chametz. For 7 days you should eat matzahs. So what do we learn from there? Dvarim she'adam yotzei b'hen yidei chavasa b'matzah, chayavin al chimutze kares. So here he says it like the opposite. For a dough which a person fulfills their obligation, if there's a dough that you fulfill your obligation for matzah, that same type of dough, if you eat it and it leavened, you're going to be chayiv kares. Right? In other words, the two are always going to be interconnected. Matzah and chametz are interconnected. So here he's saying, something you fulfill your obligation for, eating matzah, that same thing, if it's not matzah, it rises more than matzah, you're going to get kares. But if it's not something you can fulfill your obligation for matzah, you will not have kares. So this dough made with fruit juices, you cannot fulfill your obligation for matzah. Why? Since a person cannot fulfill their obligation to eat matzah with it, okay? Why? Matzah ashira, because this product is called rich matzah. You ever see, if you look closely at some products before Pesach, it says matzah ashira, literally from the word ashir. It means rich matzah. Why? Why is it called matzah shira? Because it's made with other, meaning matzah is called matzah lechem oni, poor bread. Why is it called poor bread? Because of the fact that it's simple ingredients, water and flour. Once you put more in, then it becomes more sophisticated or more rich. That's the term. So as opposed to lechem oni, which is poor bread, flour and water, when you start putting in flour, fruit juice, etc., then it becomes matzah ashira. And therefore, since you can't fulfill, that's not called lechem oni. You can't fulfill your mitzvah of matzah. Therefore, that same bread, you're not going. Maybe it's usher, but you will not get kares for it because it can't be used for matzah. Right? It's going to be that same juxtaposition. So ein chayavin ala chlamut to kares, therefore you're not liable to kares. Okay? Eisvei Rav Huna breder Rav Yeshua l'Rav Papa. So now Rav Huna the son of Rav Yeshua asks his colleague, right there again, they're having this conversation in front of the Rebbe. He says, wait a second. Him chahu ugmo. Okay, the Brisa says if a person dissolved a grain product in water and then swallowed it. Im chametzu, so basically you take like a grain product, you take like a cookie, a little cookie, you put it into water and it dissolves. Okay, so now you have water that has a dissolved cookie in it. Okay? Im chametzu, the product was chametz anush kares. You're going to get kares v'matzahu, and if it was matzah, ein adam yotze yedei chavasa b'pesach. You do not fulfill your mitzvah. Let's say you have, and this actually comes up for people who are, let's say, had their teeth. There's actually a fascinating, terrible shaila in. Rav Ashri was in the Kovna ghetto. They had an individual whose teeth were knocked out by the Nazis, and they had matzah. And he wanted to know if he's allowed to swallow the matzah mixed with water. Will he still fulfill his obligation? This is this discussion over here. It basically says if you put matzah in water, and the only way you're going to have it, and you have people, less dramatic. You have people who have dental work and they can't chew the matzah. So the only way they're going to have the matzah is by soaking it in water. Do you fulfill your obligation? The answer is you do not fulfill your obligation. And at the same time, if you have that drink, you get kares. So you see, there is not a connection between the two. Okay, he has a fascinating shuvah to it, but not for today. On the one hand, you do not fulfill your obligation for matzah, right? And yet you get kares if you drink this thing, right? So you see that there isn't a perfect correlation between the two, right? You wanted to say the reason matzah shira is not going to be, you're not going to get kares is because you don't fulfill your obligation of matzah, but we see that the two don't go hand in hand. So at that point, Interbahu Ravin, Rav Idi Bar Avin, you want to wake up your Rebbe? Say something silly in front of him. So basically, the rabbi all of a sudden wakes up. He says, what are you guys talking about? He says, Amar lahu, Dardiki, my children, hide in time to Reish Lakish. No. It's not because that pasuk that he said that you don't get kares. Rather, mishum dahavlu who may peros. It's because liquids are juices of fruits. Umei peros imachmitzin. Juices of fruits cannot cause a dough to leaven. Okay, those are the key words. He says the reason you don't get kares is because when you put fruit juice together with flour and water, or together with flour, it does not cause chametz. Okay, so what do you see from here? It sounds like he's saying that if you go ahead and make a bread with fruit juice on Pesach, it's actually amazing because it's never going to get leaven. Once you start putting like juices in it, the oil, the wine, whatever it is, then it's not going to get leaven, and therefore it's not going to be a problem, which is actually the Sephardi psak, and therefore they have no problem eating matzah shira on Pesach. Sephardim typically do. However, Ashkenazim hold, based on how they read the Gemara, they say that's only if it's exclusively fruit juice. Some of the Rishonim actually say, but if it's fruit juice and water, actually the opposite happens. Not only is it, so if it's just fruit juice, then yes, maybe it's not going to get chametz. But if it's fruit juice and water mixed together with flour, it actually leavens faster. And therefore the Ashkenazi minhag, the Ramah brings down, is that we don't eat matzah shira at all on Pesach because we're concerned that the 18 minutes that we know of, that's only flour and water. But once you put fruit juice, it actually speeds up the process, and what you're actually eating could actually become chametz at an earlier stage, and therefore we stay away from it unless the person's an old person, that has to eat this for whatever reason. But generally speaking, healthy people stay away from matzah shira entirely because the fact that it could actually be chametz, and that is the normative Ashkenazi psak. Yeah.
True, like scientific.